Hi, and welcome to the Archive of History. Tonight we journey to a moment unlike any other in the long sweep of human time, a moment when three men left the cradle of Earth and set foot upon another world. This is not a story of battles or empires, of kings or revolutions. This is the story of a single summer night in 1969, when the impossible became real, when the ancient dream of touching the moon finally came true. Before we drift off, I am always curious to know where my listeners are tuning in from and what time it is that they are listening tonight. Let me know in the comments. Imagine the silence of space. Imagine the Earth, that brilliant blue marble, shrinking behind you as you travel further than any human has ever gone. Imagine looking out a small triangular window and seeing the gray, cratered surface of the moon growing larger with each passing hour. This is what three men experienced in July of 1969. Two of them would walk upon that alien surface. One would circle above, alone, waiting for their return. Together they would accomplish something that had been dreamed about for thousands of years but achieved in a single week. Tonight we will relive that journey from beginning to end. We will stand on the launch pad as the massive rocket ignites beneath us. We will float in the silence of the spacecraft as Earth becomes a distant sphere. We will descend through the lunar sky with alarms ringing and fuel running low. And we will take those first careful steps onto a world that has watched over humanity since the very beginning of time. So settle in now. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. Let us travel back to that summer, to the humid shores of Florida, to the vast silence of space, and to the gray dust of the moon. This is the story of Apollo 11, the night humanity left Earth. The story of Apollo 11 does not begin in 1969. It begins decades earlier, in the ashes of the Second World War. The great conflict had ended, but the world had not found peace. Instead, it had divided itself into two opposing camps. On one side stood the United States and its allies, champions of democracy and capitalism. On the other stood the Soviet Union, a communist superpower that had emerged from the war bloodied but victorious. These two giants did not fight each other directly. They could not. Both possessed nuclear weapons capable of destroying civilization itself. The shadow of atomic annihilation hung over every decision, every confrontation. Instead, they competed through proxy wars, through espionage, through propaganda, and through a new and unexpected battlefield, space. The roots of this competition stretched back to the final days of World War II. As Allied forces pushed into Germany from both east and west, American and Soviet troops raced to capture Nazi rocket scientists and their technology. The Germans had developed the V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. It was a weapon of terror that had rained down on London and other cities, but it was also a technological marvel that pointed toward the future. The rocket could reach the edge of space. It could travel hundreds of miles in minutes. Both superpowers understood that whoever controlled this technology would have a tremendous advantage in the new world order. The Americans won the race for the most valuable prize. They captured Wernher von Braun, the brilliant and controversial architect of the V-2 program. Along with hundreds of his engineers and technicians, they brought them to the United States, where they would form the backbone of America's nascent rocket program. The Soviets captured their own share of German expertise and hardware. But more importantly, they had Sergei Korolev, a gifted engineer who had survived Stalin's Gulag and emerged with his genius intact. Korolev would become the chief designer of the Soviet space program, a man whose name would remain secret for decades, but whose work would shake the world. Through the 1950s, both nations developed increasingly powerful rockets, ostensibly for scientific purposes, but with the clear understanding that these same rockets could deliver nuclear warheads across continents. The public watched nervously as the superpowers tested missile after missile, each launch a demonstration of destructive potential. But there was another possibility inherent in these machines. If a rocket could lift a warhead, it could also lift a satellite. If it could reach halfway around the world, it could reach into space itself. The Soviet Union struck first, on October 4, 1957. They launched a small metal sphere into orbit around the Earth. It was called Sputnik, meaning traveler or satellite in Russian. The sphere was only about the size of a beach ball, weighing just 184 pounds. It carried no crew, no cameras, no complex instruments. It simply circled the Earth every 96 minutes, transmitting a steady radio beep that anyone with the right equipment could hear. That beep was heard around the world. Amateur radio enthusiasts picked it up and shared recordings. Newspapers printed the frequency so people could listen for themselves. It announced a new age. For the first time in history, humanity had placed an object into orbit. The space age had begun, and America had been caught completely off guard. The sound of Sputnik's beep was simple, almost innocent, but its implications were staggering. If the Soviets could put a satellite in orbit, they could put a nuclear weapon there too. The United States, protected for so long by two vast oceans, was suddenly vulnerable from above. There was no defense against a weapon falling from space. The public reaction was a mixture of fear and fascination. Some people went outside at night to watch Sputnik pass overhead, a tiny moving star crossing the sky. Others worried that the American way of life, the technological superiority that had won the war and built the prosperous post-war world, was under threat. The shock in the United States was profound. The nation that had won the war, that had built the atomic bomb, that saw itself as the technological leader of the free world, had been beaten into space by the Soviets. The reaction was a mixture of fear, embarrassment, and determination. If the Soviets could put a satellite into orbit, they could put a nuclear warhead there too. The government responded with urgency. Funding for science and engineering education exploded. New government agencies were created, and on July 29, 1958, President Dwight Eisenhower signed the National Aeronautics and Space Act, creating NASA. But the Soviets were not finished. They continued to achieve firsts that stunned the world. In 1959, they sent a probe that crashed into the Moon, the first human-made object to reach another celestial body. Later that same year, they sent another probe that photographed the far side of the Moon, the half that never faces Earth. And then, on April 12, 1961, they achieved something that seemed almost impossible. They sent a man into space. His name was Yuri Gagarin, a 27-year-old Soviet Air Force pilot. His capsule, Vostok 1, made a single orbit of the Earth. The flight lasted just 108 minutes, but in that brief time, Gagarin became the first human being to leave the Earth's atmosphere and see the planet as a whole. For the United States, this was another devastating blow. The space race was not just about technology or science. It was about prestige, about proving which system was superior. And at every turn, the Soviets seemed to be winning. The new president, John F. Kennedy, was determined to find a goal that would demonstrate American capability. He gathered his advisors, consulted with NASA, and asked them a simple question: what can we do in space that the Soviets cannot match? The answer came back: the Moon. Sending a man to the Moon and bringing him safely home would require advances in nearly every area of technology. It was dangerous, expensive, and uncertain, but it was possible. And critically, it was a goal where America and the Soviet Union were roughly equal. Neither nation had yet sent a probe to land softly on the Moon. Neither had the rockets or spacecraft to send humans there. It would be a race starting from the same line. On May 25, 1961, just 6 weeks after Gagarin's flight, President Kennedy stood before Congress and made a declaration that would define the decade. He said, "I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the Moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish." It was an astonishing commitment. At the time Kennedy made this speech, the United States had sent exactly one astronaut into space for a total of 15 minutes. That astronaut, Alan Shepard, had not even reached orbit. America had no rockets powerful enough to send a spacecraft to the Moon. It had no spacecraft designed for such a journey. Every single element of the mission would have to be invented, tested, and perfected in less than 9 years. But Kennedy's challenge was accepted. NASA's budget increased dramatically, growing from $500 million in 1960 to nearly $5.2 billion by 1965. Across the country, hundreds of thousands of people went to work on the project. Engineers, scientists, technicians, machinists, seamstresses, computer programmers, all working toward a single goal. New facilities were built. The Kennedy Space Center was constructed on the swampy coast of Florida. The Johnson Space Center rose from farmland outside Houston, Texas. Factories across the nation began producing the components of what would become the largest and most complex machine ever built. The program was called Apollo, named after the ancient Greek god of the sun, light, and prophecy. It would not be easy. In the years that followed Kennedy's speech, NASA learned hard lessons. Astronauts trained relentlessly. Unmanned probes were sent to the moon to map its surface and test landing systems. Rockets were test-fired and sometimes exploded. And then, in January 1967, tragedy struck. 3 astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, were killed when a fire erupted in their Apollo capsule during a routine ground test. The program was grounded for more than a year as engineers redesigned the spacecraft to make it safer. But the work continued. Through 1968, NASA conducted a series of test missions, each more ambitious than the last. Apollo 7 tested the command module in Earth orbit. Apollo 8, in a bold decision, sent 3 astronauts all the way to the moon, where they became the first humans to orbit another world. They circled the moon 10 times on Christmas Eve, 1968, broadcasting a reading from the Book of Genesis back to Earth. Apollo 9 tested the lunar module in Earth orbit. Apollo 10 took the lunar module to the moon and descended to within just 9 miles of the surface, a full dress rehearsal for the landing itself. And then came Apollo 11, the mission that would attempt what all the others had been building toward. 3 men were chosen for this honor. Their names were Neil Armstrong, Edwin Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. They were experienced test pilots, each with hundreds of hours in experimental aircraft and previous spaceflights. They were calm under pressure, technically brilliant, and willing to risk their lives for a goal that existed at the very edge of what was possible. Neil Alden Armstrong was the mission commander. He would be the first human being to set foot on the moon. Armstrong was born on August 5, 1930, on a farm near Wapakoneta, Ohio. He developed a passion for flying early in life. By the age of 16, before he had a driver's license, he had earned his pilot's license. He studied aeronautical engineering at Purdue University, served as a naval aviator during the Korean War, and then became a civilian test pilot. As a test pilot, he flew some of the most advanced and dangerous aircraft in existence, including the X-15 rocket plane, which could reach the edge of space. Armstrong was known for his calm demeanor and his ability to remain focused under pressure. In 1966, he commanded Gemini 8, a mission where a thruster stuck open, causing the spacecraft to spin violently. Armstrong remained calm, diagnosed the problem, and brought the spacecraft under control, saving both his life and that of his crewmate.
He spoke quietly and precisely.
He was not given to boasting or grand statements. He was an engineer at heart, a man who understood systems and probabilities. He was exactly the kind of person you would want at the controls when attempting something no one had ever done before. Edwin Eugene Aldrin Jr., known as Buzz, was the lunar module pilot. He would be the second man to walk on the moon. Aldrin was born on January 20, 1930, in Glen Ridge, New Jersey. Like Armstrong, he had been a military pilot, flying F-86 Sabre jets in the Korean War. He then went on to earn a doctorate in astronautics from MIT, writing his dissertation on orbital rendezvous techniques, the very procedures that would be crucial for Apollo missions. During the Gemini 12 mission in 1966, Aldrin had performed a spacewalk lasting over 5 hours, proving that astronauts could work effectively outside their spacecraft. Aldrin was more outgoing than Armstrong, more comfortable in the spotlight. He understood the symbolic importance of what they were doing. He had thought deeply about the meaning of walking on another world. Where Armstrong was the quiet engineer, Aldrin was the scholar and the philosopher, deeply aware that they were not just flying a spacecraft but participating in one of the great moments of human achievement. Michael Collins was the command module pilot. His role was perhaps the loneliest in the mission. While Armstrong and Aldrin descended to the moon in the lunar module, Collins would remain in orbit, alone, circling the moon every 2 hours. For portions of each orbit, when he passed behind the moon, he would lose radio contact with Earth and with his crewmates. He would be more isolated than any human being had ever been. Collins was born on October 31, 1930, in Rome, Italy, where his father, a U.S. Army officer, was stationed. He attended West Point and became an Air Force test pilot before being selected as an astronaut. He had flown on Gemini 10 in 1966. Collins was witty, articulate, and philosophical about his role. He understood that while Armstrong and Aldrin would walk on the moon, his job was equally critical. Without Collins and the command module, there was no way home. These three men trained together for months. They practiced in simulators that recreated every phase of the mission. They studied maps of the moon's surface, learning the features and landmarks of their target landing site. They ran through emergency procedures again and again, preparing for every conceivable failure. They trained in pressure suits, in underwater tanks, learning to move and work in the bulky suits they would wear on the moon. They flew helicopters that simulated the lunar module's controls, practicing the delicate task of landing a spacecraft with no wings, no runway, and no atmosphere. The spacecraft they would fly was actually two spacecraft joined together. The first was the command module, a cone-shaped capsule about 11 feet tall and 13 feet in diameter at its base. This was where all three astronauts would spend most of the mission. Inside were three couches, navigation and control systems, life support equipment, and just enough room to move around. The command module was attached to a service module containing fuel, oxygen, water, and the main rocket engine. Together, these two pieces were called the Command and Service Module, or CSM. The astronauts had named their CSM Columbia. The second spacecraft was the lunar module, called Eagle. This was the craft that would actually land on the moon. It was an ungainly, insect-like machine, all angles and struts, with no aerodynamic curves because it would only fly in the vacuum of space. It had two stages. The descent stage contained the landing engine, fuel, and landing legs. The ascent stage was the crew compartment where Armstrong and Aldrin would stand during descent and ascent. It had its own smaller rocket engine to launch them back to orbit. The lunar module was cramped, with barely enough room for two men in pressure suits to stand side by side. Both spacecraft were launched together, stacked atop the Saturn V rocket, the largest and most powerful rocket ever successfully flown. The Saturn V was a marvel of engineering, standing 363 feet tall, taller than a 30-story building. It weighed 6.2 million pounds when fully fueled. To stand at the base of the Saturn V was to feel dwarfed by human ambition made physical. The rocket was so large that it seemed to defy the very concept of flight, a skyscraper lying on its side, impossibly complex, impossibly powerful. Its first stage had 5 massive F1 engines, each producing 1.5 million pounds of thrust. These engines were themselves engineering masterpieces. Each F1 stood 19 feet tall and weighed nearly 9 tons. They burned a mixture of kerosene and liquid oxygen, consuming fuel at a rate of 3 tons per second. The turbopumps that fed fuel into the combustion chambers spun at thousands of revolutions per minute with the power output of dozens of locomotives. The exhaust from these engines during launch would create a flame trench that glowed white-hot, a river of fire that could be seen for miles. The second stage had 5 J2 engines burning liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, fuels so cold they had to be kept at temperatures approaching absolute zero. The tanks were insulated with special materials, yet even so, ice would form on the outside of the rocket before launch, sheets of frozen condensation that would crack and fall away as the structure flexed. The third stage had a single J2 engine that would fire twice, once to reach Earth orbit, and again to send the spacecraft toward the moon. This restart capability was crucial. The engine had to work perfectly after sitting dormant in the cold vacuum of space. The Saturn V was not just a rocket, it was a symphony of systems, each dependent on the others. It had miles of wiring, thousands of valves, pumps, sensors, and actuators. It had a guidance system that could navigate to the moon with extraordinary precision. It had telemetry systems that transmitted data back to Earth, allowing engineers to monitor every aspect of its performance. Building the Saturn V required advances in metallurgy, in welding, in computer design, in propulsion theory. Each stage was assembled in specially built facilities, transported on massive crawlers or by barge, and finally stacked together in the cavernous vehicle assembly building at Kennedy Space Center, a structure so large it had its own weather, clouds forming near the ceiling on humid days. The rocket that would carry Apollo 11 was designated SA-506, the sixth Saturn V, to carry a crew. It had been assembled over months, each component tested and retested. Engineers had learned from the previous flights. They had refined procedures, strengthened weak points, improved reliability. The rocket stood on Launch Complex 39A, a massive concrete structure designed to withstand the violence of launch. Flame deflectors would channel the exhaust away from the pad. Water would be poured onto the launch surface during ignition to dampen the sound waves that could otherwise damage the rocket itself. Every system had been designed with redundancy, with safety margins, with the understanding that 3 human lives would depend on everything working perfectly. Everything was ready. The rocket stood on its launch pad, a gleaming white tower topped by the red escape tower that could pull the astronauts to safety if something went wrong during launch. Searchlights illuminated it at night, making it visible for miles, a beacon of hope and ambition. The 3 astronauts underwent a final medical examination, had a final meal of steak and eggs, a tradition for astronauts before flight, and suited up in their bulky white pressure suits. They were driven to the launch pad in the early morning hours in a silver van, taking the same route that astronauts had taken on previous missions. They took an elevator up the launch tower, feeling the Florida humidity, hearing the sounds of the rocket as it vented gases and settled on its launch mount. They walked across a narrow bridge to the White Room, a small chamber at the spacecraft level, and climbed through the hatch into the command module. Technicians helped them settle into their couches, checking their suit connections, verifying communications, making sure everything was secure. These technicians knew the astronauts by name, had worked with them through training, and understood the magnitude of what they were attempting. Once the astronauts were settled, the technicians withdrew, sealing the hatch behind them. Then the service tower was rolled back, and the astronauts were alone, lying on their backs, looking up at the sky through the small windows above them, feeling the occasional tremor as the rocket shifted slightly on its launch mount, waiting for dawn and for the countdown to reach 0. The waiting was perhaps the hardest part, time stretching out, giving space for thoughts of what could go wrong, of the thousands of things that had to go right, of the families watching from the beaches, of the world waiting to see if they would succeed or become another cautionary tale about human ambition reaching too far. The morning of July 16, 1969, arrived with the humid heat typical of a Florida summer. The sun rose over the Atlantic Ocean, its light spreading across the flat coastal landscape and illuminating the massive white rocket standing on its launch pad. The Saturn V gleamed in the early light, venting streams of vapor from its super-cold fuel tanks. Ice formed on the sides of the rocket where the liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen were kept at temperatures hundreds of degrees below 0. Inside the command module, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins had been lying on their backs for more than 2 hours. They were sealed inside their spacecraft, breathing pure oxygen. The cabin was small, confining. They could hear the sounds of the rocket around them, the creaking of metal as the structure expanded and contracted with temperature changes, the hiss of fuel flowing through lines, the voices of the launch controllers coming through their headsets. They ran through checklists, tested systems, and verified that everything was functioning correctly. Around them, the world watched. Nearly 1 million people had gathered along the beaches and roadways near the Kennedy Space Center, hoping to see the launch in person. They sat in lawn chairs, stood on car roofs, and peered through binoculars at the distant rocket. In homes across America and around the world, people turned on their televisions to watch the live broadcast. It was estimated that 650 million people, about 1/5 of the entire human population at that time, would watch or listen to some part of the Apollo 11 mission. In the firing room at the Kennedy Space Center, the launch director and his team monitored the countdown. Every system had to be checked, every valve confirmed in the correct position, every sensor reading within acceptable limits. The countdown proceeded through planned holds, pauses built into the schedule to allow for final verifications. Weather conditions were evaluated. The trajectory was calculated based on the current positions of the Earth and Moon. At T-9 minutes, the countdown entered its final phase. There would be no more holds. At T-3 minutes and 7 seconds, the rocket switched to internal power. At T-50 seconds, the Saturn V's onboard computers took over the countdown. The astronauts felt the rocket come alive beneath them. At T-8.9 seconds, the 5 F1 engines of the first stage ignited in sequence, their thunder building to a roar that could be heard for miles. The engines reached full thrust, producing 7.5 million pounds of force. Inside the command module, the astronauts felt the vibration, heard the noise even through their helmets. Armstrong's heart rate, monitored by sensors, remained steady at about 110 beats per minute. He watched his instruments, ready to trigger an abort if anything went wrong. At T-0, the hold-down clamps released. The massive rocket began to rise. For a moment it seemed to hang in the air, barely moving. Then it rose faster, clearing the launch tower in less than 10 seconds. The Saturn V climbed on a column of white-hot flame, trailing a plume of smoke and vapor that stretched for miles. The launch commentator announced, "Liftoff, we have a liftoff, 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff, on Apollo 11. The crowd on the beaches erupted in cheers. The sound reached them several seconds after liftoff, a rolling wave of thunder that seemed to shake the air itself. Inside the spacecraft, Armstrong reported, "Roger, tower clear." The rocket was climbing smoothly, gaining speed rapidly as it burned through its fuel and became lighter. The astronauts were pressed back into their couches by the acceleration, feeling the building force of 3 times Earth's gravity. The ride was rough, with vibrations that made it difficult to read the instruments, but everything was functioning correctly. At an altitude of about 38 miles and a speed of more than 6,000 miles per hour, the first stage completed its burn. The engines shut down, and for a moment the astronauts experienced weightlessness. Then explosive bolts fired, separating the first stage. The 5 engines of the second stage ignited, accelerating the spacecraft once again. The ride was smoother now. The acceleration pressed the astronauts back into their couches again. At an altitude of 115 miles, the second stage shut down and separated. The single J2 engine of the third stage ignited, giving a final push to place the spacecraft into Earth orbit. At a speed of about 17,500 miles per hour, the engine shut down. Apollo 11 was in orbit around the Earth. The launch had taken just over 11 minutes. Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins unbuckled their harnesses and floated in the cabin. They were weightless now, a strange and exhilarating sensation. Objects that were not secured floated freely. The sensation of up and down disappeared. They spent the next 2.5 hours in Earth orbit, checking systems, preparing for the next critical step. Then came the moment they called trans-lunar injection. The third stage engine would fire again, accelerating the spacecraft from orbital velocity to escape velocity, the speed needed to break free of Earth's gravity and coast to the Moon. At the appointed moment, Mission Control gave the command. The engine ignited, burning for about 5 minutes and accelerating the spacecraft to more than 24,000 miles per hour. When the burn was complete, Armstrong reported, "Hey Houston, Apollo 11. That Saturn gave us a magnificent ride." The third stage shut down and separated. The command module now had to perform a delicate maneuver. It turned around, maneuvered close to the separated third stage, and docked with the lunar module, which had been stored inside the upper part of the third stage. Collins, operating the maneuvering thrusters, guided the command module's docking probe into the drogue on the lunar module. The 2 spacecraft latched together. Then the combined craft pulled away from the third stage. Apollo 11 was now configured for the journey to the Moon. The command and service module, with the lunar module docked to its nose, coasted through space. The astronauts settled into a routine for the 3-day journey. They ate, slept, performed housekeeping tasks, checked systems, and stared out the windows at the Earth receding behind them. The planet, so vast and dominant from the ground, became a sphere, then a disk, then a brilliant blue and white jewel suspended in the blackness. The view was unlike anything any of them had imagined. From this distance, the Earth showed its true nature, a single interconnected world, fragile and beautiful. The continents were visible, the swirl of clouds over the oceans, the thin blue line of the atmosphere clinging to the surface. There were no borders visible from space, no signs of the nations and ideologies that divided humanity on the ground. The Moon, ahead of them, grew slowly larger, its grey surface resolving into craters and mountains and vast dark plains. The journey was both monotonous and extraordinary. Time took on a different quality in the spacecraft. There was no day or night in the traditional sense. The sun shone constantly unless they were in the shadow of the Earth or Moon. The astronauts followed a schedule set by mission control with designated times for sleep, meals, and work. But sleep was difficult. The spacecraft was noisy, filled with the hum of fans, the whir of pumps, the occasional snap or pop as the structure expanded and contracted with temperature changes. The cabin was small, cramped, with barely enough room for 3 men. They could not stand upright. They floated, drifting in weightlessness, occasionally bumping into each other or into equipment. Personal space was a luxury they did not have. They ate from vacuum-sealed packages, food that had been freeze-dried or thermostabilized. They rehydrated meals with water from the spacecraft's tanks, squeezed food from tubes, ate with spoons designed not to float away. The food was functional, but not particularly appetizing. Favorites included shrimp cocktail, beef stew, and butterscotch pudding. They drank orange juice and coffee, always careful with liquids, which formed perfect spheres in weightlessness and could drift into equipment or into someone's face if not contained. They performed housekeeping tasks that would have been trivial on Earth, but required thought and care in zero gravity. They collected waste, managed the carbon dioxide removal system, monitored oxygen levels, adjusted cabin temperature. They took navigational sightings, using a sextant to measure the angles between stars and the Earth or Moon, calculations that would verify their trajectory. They conducted television broadcasts, setting up a camera and narrating for the audience back home, showing what life was like in space, demonstrating how objects floated, how they moved, how they worked in this alien environment. The spacecraft was in what is called a free return trajectory. If the engine failed and they could not slow down to enter lunar orbit, the Moon's gravity would swing them around and send them back toward Earth without any further burns. This was a safety feature, a way to ensure survival even if critical systems failed, but it meant they were committed to their path. The Moon's gravity was pulling them forward, accelerating them, drawing them inexorably toward encounter. The astronauts drifted through the cabin in their flight suits, no longer needing the bulky pressure suits. They talked with mission control, receiving updates on news from Earth, messages from their families, technical information about spacecraft systems and trajectory adjustments. They tried to rest during their scheduled sleep periods, floating in sleeping bags tethered to the walls or simply drifting in the cabin, eyes closed, seeking rest that often proved elusive. There was a profound sense of isolation that grew stronger with each passing hour. The Earth was shrinking behind them, becoming smaller, more distant. The Moon was still distant ahead, growing larger but still days away. They were in the emptiness between worlds, traveling faster than any humans had ever traveled, but surrounded by a silence so complete it was almost physical. The darkness outside the windows was absolute, deeper than any darkness on Earth. The stars shone with unwavering clarity, no atmosphere to make them twinkle, just points of light scattered across the infinite void. Collins later described the feeling, "I don't mean to deny a feeling of solitude. It is there, reinforced by the fact that radio contact with the Earth abruptly cuts off at the instant I disappear behind the Moon. I am alone now, truly alone, and absolutely isolated from any known life. I am it." If a count were taken, the score would be 3 billion plus 2 over on the other side of the Moon, and 1 plus God knows what on this side. The journey continued, hour after hour, day after day. They crossed the point where the Earth's gravity and the Moon's gravity were equal, the gravitational watershed between worlds. From there, the Moon's pull dominated, accelerating them faster toward their destination. They began to see details on the lunar surface that had never been visible from Earth. The craters resolved into three-dimensional features, some with central peaks, some with terraced walls. The Maria, the dark plains, showed subtle variations in color and texture. The highlands were bright, heavily cratered, ancient. This was a world that had been geologically dead for billions of years, its surface a record of impacts stretching back to the formation of the solar system. On the fourth day, July 19th, the astronauts prepared for lunar orbit insertion. The service module's main engine would fire, slowing the spacecraft enough to be captured by the Moon's gravity. If the burn failed, they would swing around the Moon and head back to Earth on the free return trajectory. If the burn was too long, they could crash into the Moon. The burn had to be precise, executed with split-second accuracy. The engine fired on schedule, behind the Moon, out of contact with Earth. For 6 minutes, the astronauts felt the deceleration. When the burn was complete, they were in orbit around the moon. As they came back around the front, Collins reported, "Houston, Apollo 11, we're going right down US-1. They were there. They were in orbit around the moon. For the first time, the three astronauts could see the lunar surface clearly through their windows. It was gray, heavily cratered, stark, and alien. The sun cast harsh shadows, creating a landscape of bright highlights and pitch-black shadows. There was no atmosphere, no weather, no life. It was a dead world, unchanged for billions of years, and somewhere down there, on a relatively smooth plain called the Sea of Tranquility, they would attempt a landing the next day. The astronauts orbited the moon for more than a full day before attempting the landing. They needed to rest, to check systems, and to study the surface below. They photographed their target landing site, comparing what they saw with the maps they had studied during training. The Sea of Tranquility was one of the large, dark, relatively flat plains visible from Earth. These areas are called Maria, Latin for seas, because early astronomers thought they might be actual bodies of water. They are actually ancient lava flows, solidified billions of years ago. The landing site had been chosen carefully. It needed to be flat enough to land safely, free of large boulders or steep slopes. It needed to be on the near side of the moon so that the astronauts could maintain radio contact with Earth. And it needed to be in a location where the sun would be at a low angle, casting shadows that would help the astronauts judge distances. On July 20th, Armstrong and Aldrin, dressed in their pressure suits, floated through the tunnel connecting the command module to the lunar module. They entered Eagle and began powering up its systems. Collins sealed the hatch behind them. The two spacecraft were still connected, orbiting the moon together, but they were preparing for separation. Armstrong and Aldrin methodically worked through checklists, verifying that every system in the lunar module was functioning. On their 13th orbit with Mission Control's approval, Collins operated the release mechanism. The command module and the lunar module separated. Collins fired the command module's thrusters to move away. He would remain in orbit, circling the moon every 2 hours, waiting for Armstrong and Aldrin to complete their mission and return. The descent engine fired on schedule, beginning to slow the lunar module. This was called the de-orbit burn. For 30 seconds the engine burned, then shut down. The astronauts were now committed. If they did not fire the engine again to land, they would crash into the moon. As Eagle came around the front of the moon, the descent began in earnest. The spacecraft was oriented with the engine facing forward, firing to slow it down. Armstrong and Aldrin stood at their stations, looking out the triangular windows, watching the lunar surface approach. The descent was controlled by the onboard computer. The astronauts monitored the systems, ready to take over manual control if anything went wrong. At an altitude of about 50,000 feet, the engine throttled up to full power. The spacecraft slowed and began to tip forward, giving the astronauts a view of the surface below. They could see the craters passing beneath them, growing larger and more detailed. Then, at an altitude of about 33,000 feet, an alarm sounded. A yellow light illuminated on the control panel, and a code appeared on the computer's display, 1202. It was a program alarm indicating that the computer was overloaded. Armstrong called to Mission Control, "Program alarm, 1202. His voice was calm, professional. In Mission Control in Houston, flight controllers scrambled to determine what the alarm meant. A young engineer named Jack Garman checked his notes. He knew that 1202 meant the computer was receiving more data than it could process in real time, but it was not critical. The computer was prioritizing its tasks. As long as the alarms were not continuous, they could proceed. Within seconds, the flight director relayed to Armstrong and Aldrin, "We'll go on that alarm." The alarm sounded several more times during the descent. Each time Mission Control confirmed they were safe to continue. At an altitude of 3,000 feet, the lunar module pitched further forward, giving the astronauts a clear view of the landing site. Armstrong looked out and saw that the computer was guiding them toward a field of large boulders surrounding a crater. It was not a safe place to land. He took manual control of the spacecraft. Using the hand controller, Armstrong flew the lunar module forward, searching for a smoother area. Aldrin called out altitude and velocity readings. 300 feet, down 3.5, 47 forward, 1 minute fuel. They had only 1 minute of fuel remaining. If they did not land within that time, they would have to abort. 200 feet, 4.5 down. Armstrong kept flying, his eyes scanning the surface. 11 forward, coming down nicely. 100 feet, 3.5 down. The fuel gauge was dropping. 60 seconds, called the controller responsible for fuel. Armstrong kept his focus on the landing site. He was descending slowly now, carefully. At an altitude of 40 feet, the engine exhaust began stirring up lunar dust, creating a moving shadow and obscuring the surface. 30 seconds. Aldrin continued reading out altitude. 30 feet, down 2.5, picking up some dust. The lunar module descended through the dust. Armstrong could barely see the surface now. The landing legs had probes that would touch the surface first and illuminate a light. Contact light, called Aldrin. One of the probes had touched the moon. Armstrong immediately shut down the descent engine. For a moment the lunar module hung in the air. Then, with a gentle bump, it touched down. The 4 landing pads settled into the lunar dust. There was a moment of silence. Then Aldrin said quietly, "Okay, engine stop." Armstrong confirmed, "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." It was 4:17 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on July 20th, 1969. In Mission Control, controllers erupted in cheers and applause. The Capcom, Charlie Duke, responded, "Roger, Tranquility, we copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again." They had done it. After years of preparation, after thousands of hours of training, after traveling 250,000 miles, they had landed on the moon. They were standing on the surface of another world. They were the first human beings to land on the moon. The plan had been for the astronauts to rest after landing, to sleep before exiting the spacecraft. But Armstrong and Aldrin were too excited, too alert. They requested permission to skip the sleep period and proceed directly to the moonwalk. Mission Control agreed. The preparations took longer than expected. The lunar module was cramped and the astronauts had to be methodical. They first depressurized the cabin, venting the oxygen to match the vacuum outside. Then they prepared their portable life support systems, the backpacks that would provide oxygen, remove carbon dioxide, regulate temperature, and provide radio communication during the moonwalk. The suits they wore were marvels of engineering. Each suit was custom-made, constructed of multiple layers of material designed to protect against extreme temperatures, micrometeorites, and radiation. The outer layer was white to reflect sunlight. Inside were layers of insulation, a pressure bladder, and a cooling garment with water tubes. The suits were bulky and stiff, making movement difficult, but they were essential for survival. Armstrong and Aldrin helped each other put on their backpacks, checked each other's suit seals, and verified that all systems were functioning. Finally, more than 6 hours after landing, they were ready. Armstrong moved to the hatch, a small square opening at the front of the lunar module. He pulled the hatch open and crawled through on his hands and knees. Outside the hatch was a small platform. Armstrong stood on the porch and pulled a lanyard that deployed a folded compartment containing cameras and equipment. Then he descended the ladder, a 9-rung ladder attached to the front leg of the lunar module. A television camera mounted on the side of the lunar module was transmitting a grainy black and white image back to Earth. More than 600 million people were watching. Armstrong climbed down slowly, carefully. At the bottom of the ladder, he stepped onto one of the landing pads. He paused there, testing his weight, feeling the 1/6 gravity of the moon. Then he spoke the words that would be remembered forever. "I'm going to step off the LM now." He lifted his left foot off the landing pad and placed it onto the lunar surface. It was 10:56 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on July 20th, 1969. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," Armstrong said. The statement became iconic. This single step represented the culmination of thousands of years of human dreaming, hundreds of years of scientific progress, and nearly a decade of focused effort. Armstrong stood on the moon. He looked around, describing what he saw. "The surface is fine and powdery. I can kick it up loosely with my toe. It adheres in fine layers like powdered charcoal to the sole and sides of my boots. I only go in a small fraction of an inch, maybe 1/8 of an inch. The dust was unlike anything on Earth, sharp and angular because there was no wind or water to erode it, sticky because there was no moisture to make it clump. Each particle had remained unchanged for millions or billions of years lying on the surface, waiting for this moment. The footprints Armstrong left were perfect impressions, sharp-edged, crisp, recording every detail of his boot treads. They would remain there, unchanged, for millions of years, preserved in the airless environment where nothing erodes, nothing decays, nothing changes. The experience of walking on the moon was both familiar and completely alien. The gravity was 1/6 that of Earth, strong enough to keep him grounded but weak enough that every movement felt light, effortless. Armstrong took careful steps at first, testing his balance, learning how to move in this new environment. He found that he could easily carry the weight of his pressure suit and backpack, which on Earth would have been exhausting, but here felt manageable. The suit was still stiff, still restrictive, but the low gravity compensated. He could bend, reach, and move with surprising ease once he adapted to the rhythm. The landscape around him was simultaneously beautiful and desolate. The surface was gray, varying from light gray to dark gray depending on the material. The horizon was closer than on Earth, the moon being a smaller world, creating a sense that the world curved away more sharply. The sky was utterly black, a darkness that was absolute and profound. On Earth, even at night, the sky has some light, some glow from stars or atmospheric scattering. Here there was nothing. The sky was the void of space itself, and it pressed down to the surface with no transition, no buffer. The sun was blindingly bright, a harsh white point of light that cast stark shadows with no gradual transitions. Where the sunlight hit, the temperature was well above the boiling point of water. In the shadows, it was hundreds of degrees below zero. There was no atmosphere to moderate the extremes, no air to scatter light and create the soft gradations of shadow and light that make Earth's landscape comprehensible. About 19 minutes after Armstrong's first step, Aldrin began his descent down the ladder. Armstrong photographed him as he emerged from the lunar module and climbed down, capturing iconic images that would be reproduced millions of times. When Aldrin stepped onto the surface, he paused and took a moment to look around, turning slowly, taking in the landscape. Then he said, memorably, "Beautiful view, magnificent desolation." It was a perfect description of the stark, alien landscape. Beautiful because it was pristine, untouched, a world frozen in time. Desolate because it was lifeless, empty, a place where nothing had ever grown, where nothing had ever moved, except the slow bombardment of meteorites and the patient advance of shadows as the sun crossed the sky. The two astronauts moved around the landing site, adapting to the 1/6 gravity. They found that the most efficient way to move was a bounding lope, pushing off gently and gliding between steps, almost like moving in slow motion. Walking normally was possible, but felt awkward. The loping gait allowed them to cover ground quickly while maintaining balance. They were in no danger of falling because they fell so slowly in the low gravity. If they stumbled, they had time to catch themselves, time to adjust their balance. The bulky suits made their movements clumsy, but the low gravity helped compensate. They looked like strange mechanical creatures, white against the gray surface, moving with an alien grace. The sun was low on the horizon, about 10 degrees above the surface, casting long shadows that stretched across the landscape. This low angle was intentional, chosen to make features visible, to create contrast that would help them see the terrain. At high noon on the moon, with the sun directly overhead, the landscape would have been washed out, features invisible in the harsh light. The sky was black, even though the sun was shining, a phenomenon that never failed to seem wrong to astronauts who had grown up on Earth, where a bright sun meant a bright sky. There was no atmosphere to scatter light, no air molecules to create the blue color that humans associate with daylight. The sky remained the perfect blackness of space. The Earth was visible, a small blue and white sphere hanging in the darkness, bright and beautiful against the void. It was in its crescent phase from the moon's perspective, 3/4 illuminated, showing the continents and oceans that were home to all of humanity, except the 3 men of Apollo 11. Armstrong set up the television camera on a tripod about 40 feet from the lunar module. He then worked with Aldrin to deploy several scientific experiments. They set up a seismometer to detect moonquakes. They deployed a laser-ranging retroflector, an array of mirrors that scientists on Earth could target with lasers to measure the precise distance to the moon. They collected rock and soil samples, carefully documenting where each came from. One of their most symbolic tasks was planting the American flag. The flag had been specially designed for the moon, with a horizontal rod along the top edge to hold it extended. They hammered the pole into the ground, struggling with the hard subsurface. The pole would only go down about 7 inches, and it tilted slightly. But it stood, the stars and stripes bright against the dark sky. Shortly after the flag was planted, they received a call from Earth. President Richard Nixon, from the Oval Office, spoke to them in what he called the most historic telephone call ever made. Nixon said, "Because of what you have done, the heavens have become a part of man's world." Armstrong and Aldrin continued their work. They moved carefully, aware that a rip in their suits would be fatal. They collected 47.5 pounds of lunar material. They took hundreds of photographs, documenting everything. The photographs would become some of the most famous images in history. Aldrin standing on the moon with Armstrong reflected in his visor, the lunar module against the black sky, the boot print in the lunar dust. The moonwalk lasted 2.5 hours. It was physically demanding, despite the low gravity. The suits were stiff and made every movement an effort. The astronauts' hands became sore from gripping tools inside the pressurized gloves. They grew hot despite the cooling systems. Finally, they returned to the lunar module, carrying the samples and equipment inside. They sealed the hatch and began repressurizing the cabin. Once the cabin was repressurized, they removed their helmets and gloves. They ate a meal, drank water, and tried to rest. They were supposed to sleep for 7 hours, but sleep was difficult. The cabin was noisy, the temperature was uncomfortable, and they were still too excited. They dozed fitfully. Above them, Michael Collins continued to orbit the moon in the command module Columbia. He had spent the time photographing the lunar surface, maintaining the spacecraft and waiting. Every 2 hours he passed over the landing site, searching with binoculars for any sign of the lunar module. He never saw it, but he knew his crewmates were there and he waited, ready to rendezvous with them. After about 21 hours on the lunar surface, Armstrong and Aldrin began preparations for launch. This was perhaps the most critical phase of the mission. The lunar module's ascent stage engine had to work perfectly. There was no backup. If it failed, the astronauts would be stranded. There had been no way to test the engine under lunar conditions. It had to work the first time. The 2 astronauts ran through checklists, verifying every system. They jettisoned equipment. They no longer needed to reduce weight. Every pound mattered because the ascent stage engine had limited fuel. They pressurized the fuel tanks and armed the engine. At the appointed time, Aldrin pressed the button to fire the engine. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the engine ignited, and the ascent stage lifted off from the descent stage, which remained on the moon. The astronauts were pressed back into their stations by the acceleration. The engine burned smoothly, lifting them from the surface. The ascent stage had no landing legs, no ability to land again. It was designed for one purpose: to get them back to orbit. The engine burned for about 7 minutes, then shut down. The lunar module was in orbit around the moon. Now came the rendezvous. They had to find the command module, match speeds and orbits, and dock. The process would take several hours and multiple engine burns. Collins, in the command module, had been tracking the lunar module with his radar and navigation systems. He adjusted his orbit slightly. Armstrong and Aldrin fired their thrusters, refining their orbit, slowly closing the distance. The 2 spacecraft appeared as tiny dots against the vast emptiness of space. Collins could see the lunar module approaching. He controlled the command module's thrusters, making final adjustments. Armstrong and Aldrin did the same. At a relative velocity of just a few feet per second, the 2 spacecraft came together. The docking probe entered the drogue. Latches engaged. The 2 spacecraft were docked. There was a moment of relief and celebration. Collins opened the hatch to the tunnel. Armstrong and Aldrin, still in their dusty suits, floated through. The 3 astronauts were together again for the first time in more than 24 hours. They shook hands and grinned at each other. They had done it. The lunar module was no longer needed. They transferred the sample containers, film and equipment into the command module. Then they sealed the hatch and jettisoned the lunar module. The command and service module, Columbia, was now the only spacecraft. It would carry them home. The astronauts fired the service module's main engine, executing the trans-Earth injection burn, accelerating from lunar orbit and sending them back toward Earth. The burn had to be precise. The engine fired perfectly, and the spacecraft headed home. The return journey took 3 days. The astronauts settled back into the routine of eating, sleeping, and checking systems. The moon receded behind them. the Earth grew larger ahead. They performed a mid-course correction burn to refine their trajectory. As they approached Earth, they separated the service module. The command module, with its heat shield facing forward, was now the only piece that would return. The three astronauts were sealed inside, strapped into their couches, wearing their pressure suits again. The command module entered Earth's atmosphere at more than 24,000 miles per hour, the fastest any human beings had ever traveled. The heat shield heated to more than 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit as friction slowed the spacecraft. The astronauts experienced deceleration forces of more than 6 times Earth's gravity. They were pressed hard into their couches. Outside the windows, they could see a plasma sheath, a glowing envelope of ionized gas surrounding the spacecraft. Radio communications were cut off for several minutes. Mission Control and the world waited, hoping the heat shield was intact. Then, as the spacecraft slowed, the plasma dissipated. Communications resumed. "Hello, Houston," Armstrong called. "This is Apollo 11. Do you read?" Mission Control responded immediately. "Roger, Apollo 11, we read you. Welcome home." The command module deployed its parachutes, first 2 small drogue chutes, then 3 large main parachutes, that slowed the descent to about 22 miles per hour. The spacecraft descended toward the Pacific Ocean. It splashed down at 12:50 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on July 24, 1969, about 900 miles southwest of Hawaii. The entire mission had lasted 8 days, 3 hours, 18 minutes, and 35 seconds. The command module floated upright in the gentle ocean swells. U.S. Navy divers from the recovery ship U.S. Hornet jumped from helicopters and secured flotation collars around the spacecraft. They opened the hatch and handed in biological isolation garments, special suits designed to prevent any potential lunar microorganisms from contaminating Earth. The astronauts put on the isolation suits and were lifted by helicopter to the aircraft carrier. On the Hornet, they entered a mobile quarantine facility, a sealed trailer where they would remain isolated for the first part of their 3-week quarantine. Through the window of the facility, they could see President Nixon, who had flown to the carrier to greet them. The astronauts waved and smiled. They had completed the greatest adventure in human history and returned safely home. The quarantine was a precaution based on the remote possibility that lunar microorganisms could pose a threat to life on Earth. Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins spent 3 weeks in isolation, monitored for any signs of illness. The lunar samples were also kept in isolation and handled in sealed chambers. As the days passed and no signs of contamination appeared, scientists became confident that the moon was sterile. After 3 weeks, the astronauts were released. The celebrations were immense. New York City held a ticker-tape parade, with millions lining the streets. The astronauts visited 25 countries in 45 days, greeted by heads of state and crowds. They were awarded medals, given honors, celebrated as symbols of human achievement. But the astronauts themselves remained humble. They insisted they were representatives of a vast team of engineers, scientists, and support staff who had made the mission possible. The impact of Apollo 11 was profound. It demonstrated that humans could accomplish goals that seemed beyond reach. It inspired a generation of scientists, engineers, and explorers. It provided a moment of unity for a world divided by war and ideology. For a brief time, people around the globe shared a common pride in human achievement. The photographs of Earth taken from the moon, showing the planet as a fragile blue sphere hanging in the darkness, changed how people saw their world. It reinforced the idea that Earth was a single, interconnected system, that national borders were invisible from space, that humanity shared a common home that was precious and finite. The mission accomplished something that transcended its technical goals. It proved that humanity could work together toward a common purpose. The Apollo program employed more than 400,000 people across thousands of companies and institutions. It required cooperation between government agencies, universities, and private industry. It brought together people from different backgrounds, different disciplines, different parts of the country, all focused on a single objective. The program created a sense of national purpose that cut across political divisions. Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives could all take pride in what had been accomplished. It was a rare moment of consensus in a turbulent decade marked by the Vietnam War, civil rights struggles, and generational conflict. The technological legacy was equally profound. The Apollo program drove innovation across multiple fields. The need for lightweight, powerful computers led to advances in miniaturization and software development that would later enable the personal computer revolution. The materials developed for spacecraft, heat shields, and pressure suits found applications in everything from firefighting gear to athletic shoes. The management techniques developed to coordinate the massive program, the systems of quality control and project management, influenced how large-scale projects were organized in both government and private industry. Communication technology advanced dramatically, driven by the need to transmit data across hundreds of thousands of miles of space. The scientific legacy of Apollo 11 and the subsequent Apollo missions was equally significant. The lunar samples provided invaluable information about the moon's composition, age, and history. Analysis of these rocks confirmed that the moon was formed from material ejected when a Mars-sized object collided with the early Earth about 4.5 billion years ago, a catastrophic impact that shaped both bodies. The rocks revealed that the moon had once been geologically active, with volcanic activity creating the Maria. They showed that the lunar surface was ancient, with some rocks dating back more than 4 billion years, preserving a record of the early solar system that had been erased on Earth by geological activity and erosion. The seismometers left on the moon detected moonquakes and provided information about the moon's internal structure, revealing that it had a small core and a thick mantle. The laser retroreflectors allowed scientists to measure the Earth-Moon distance with incredible precision, showing that the moon is gradually moving away from Earth at a rate of about 1.5 inches per year. This measurement confirmed theories about tidal forces and helped test aspects of Einstein's general relativity. The experiments conducted on the lunar surface, though limited by the brief duration of the Apollo 11 moonwalk, opened the door for more extensive scientific work on later missions. Beyond the tangible achievements, Apollo 11 had a psychological and philosophical impact that is harder to measure but equally important. It changed how humanity saw itself. For thousands of years, humans had looked up at the moon and wondered what it would be like to go there. Poets wrote about it, artists painted it, philosophers speculated about it. It was the symbol of the unreachable, the impossible dream. Then, in July 1969, that dream became real. 2 men walked on the moon and came home safely. The impossible had become merely difficult. The boundary of human capability had expanded. If we could go to the moon, what else might be possible? The mission also reinforced a more sobering reality. The Apollo astronauts looked back at Earth from the moon and saw a small, fragile world hanging in the vast darkness of space. They saw how thin the atmosphere was, how delicate the boundary between the habitable surface and the lethal vacuum beyond. They saw a planet that was beautiful but vulnerable, a world that needed to be protected and cherished. This perspective, called the overview effect, influenced many of the astronauts profoundly and contributed to the growing environmental movement of the 1970s. The first Earth Day was held in April 1970, less than a year after Apollo 11, and the famous Earthrise photograph from Apollo 8 became a symbol of environmental awareness. Apollo 11 was followed by 6 more Apollo missions, 5 of which successfully landed on the moon. Then the program ended. The political will that had driven it faded. The remaining planned missions were cancelled. No human has walked on the moon since December 1972. In the decades since, the Apollo missions have taken on an almost mythical quality. The accomplishments seem almost impossible. The technology was primitive by today's standards. The computers had less processing power than a modern smartphone. That they succeeded is a testament to human ingenuity, courage, and determination. There are plans to return to the moon. NASA's Artemis program aims to land astronauts on the lunar surface in the coming years. Other nations have expressed interest in lunar exploration. Private companies are developing spacecraft and launch systems. The dream of space exploration continues, but Apollo 11 will always hold a special place. It was the first. It was the moment when humanity stepped beyond Earth and proved that the universe was not beyond our reach. The footprints left by Armstrong and Aldrin remain on the moon today, unchanged in the airless environment. They will remain there for millions of years, a permanent monument to human achievement. The story of Apollo 11 is ultimately a story about human potential. It shows what we can achieve when we dare to dream, when we refuse to accept that something cannot be done, when we focus our efforts on a common goal. And so our story comes to a close. We have traveled back to that extraordinary summer, to the humid launch pad in Florida, through the silence of space, to the gray dust of the moon's surface, and safely home again. We have witnessed a moment when the impossible became real, when three men accomplished what no one had ever done before. As you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps you can imagine yourself standing on that lunar surface, looking up at the Earth hanging in the black sky, seeing your home planet from a perspective that only a handful of humans have ever experienced. Perhaps you can feel the sense of awe and wonder that Armstrong and Aldrin described. Perhaps you can appreciate the profound achievement represented by those first steps in the lunar dust. The footprints remain there today, undisturbed. They will remain there for millions of years, long after everyone who witnessed the landing has passed away. They are a monument to human curiosity, to human ambition, to the drive to explore that has pushed our species forward throughout history. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time. Thank you for settling in and allowing me to guide you through the story of Apollo 11, the night humanity left Earth. It has been an honor to share this remarkable tale with you. May you dream tonight of distant worlds, of boundless possibilities, of the courage to reach beyond what seems possible. May you remember that we are all passengers on that blue sphere that Armstrong and Aldrin saw from the moon, all part of a single human family sharing a precious and fragile home. Rest well, sleep peacefully, and know that the legacy of Apollo 11, that moment of achievement and wonder, continues to shine like the moon itself, a light in the darkness, a reminder of what we have accomplished and what we might yet achieve. Until our next journey into history, good night.